error. Okay, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Rodrigo Luis de Alburquerque in the SCA. Today we'll be talking about some tools that can help you get started on writing a research paper, right? Now, I say research paper, that may be the entry category that you have in your kingdom associated with a scholarly paper, or it may be a more general introduction for any other entry type. I think one thing that I really want people to take away from this is that you are doing research, even if you're not entering a research paper, right? Really, our goals here are improving the results with your readers, right? We'll talk about how you can orient your work in a way that makes it perceived the way that you want it to be perceived. I've used this approach both in mundane academic writing and in writing in the SCA to a decent degree of success. And I found it very helpful. I hope you will too. Okay, let's start. Okay. Is everybody able to see that? Awesome. So our focus today will be on going through in an interactive way the 5 C's. These are 5 elements of the intro to the introduction of a paper. We'll talk through how to join an ongoing research conversation. Again, this is something you're doing, whether it's something you're doing consciously or not, and how to quickly place your writing within that conversation. Our goal with this is to orient the reader's expectations to align with our goals for the remainder of the paper. We want to make sure everybody's on board before we take them into that process. The tool that we'll use to accomplish those goals is the introduction to the paper. Most people see the introduction as something that I need to get this written. I've been told I have to have one. I really want to get to the cool stuff, right? The methods, the results especially, right? But this is something that can do the most lifting of any section of your paper if you allow it to. It's important to remember here that our introduction should serve a distinct purpose, though, right? It's only as useful as we make it. And we want the reader to leave it with the impression that we want them to have for the remainder of our paper, right? We want to be on the same page before we move on from this. So before we move on, I just want to get a quick idea of your areas of interest. Even if you're not an A&S person just yet, right? Hopefully you all will be at some point. What would you say your main focus is in the arts and sciences? Again, even if you haven't entered anything yet, what do you see yourself entering down the line? We're going to use the Zoom whiteboard tool if we can, and we will drop some sticky notes on it. Oops, it loads. Okay, so you have a pad of sticky notes on the left hand of your screen there. If you want to drag one out and drop it, you're able to write on that and tell us what you're interested in. It looks like we got a pretty good spread, yeah. Okay, looks like we've got a lot of neat stuff here, right? I want to keep these topics in mind. We're going to go ahead and swing back to the presentation. We'll come back here and we'll work on different stages of this. Everybody okay to move on? Well, these are great. These are even better things that I'm not super familiar with. So that's exactly what I would like to see in most A&S fairs, right? I don't want to hear myself talk and do that enough. Okay, so let's go back to that slide deck. Okay, so before we move on, we've got this idea of what folks are interested in. We'll talk at each stage about how we can incorporate this process with those topics. Okay. So I'll be pulling pretty heavily from an article by Lange and Fair in 2017 to talk about how I typically approach the very start of a paper. Again, I've said this, I call this the introduction to the introduction. That's a pretty common phrasing for this. This is not the whole text of your introduction. You'll probably have text after this before you hit the next major section of any paper or documentation set, right? this paper, the original one that you see on your screen, was written in the context of framing submissions for an academic journal, specifically the Academy of Management Review. These two guys were the editors at the time. But I found it useful for getting started quickly on writing an introduction in a way that will get the reader invested in your writing, regardless of what you're writing about. I do want to emphasize, though, this is not gospel, right? But if this is something you struggle with, if you have trouble getting initial traction on how to write a paper, this is worth a try, I think. Now, depending on the type of paper you're writing, you may need significantly more or less than what you end up writing in this intro to the intro before you hit that next major section. But that decision should be shaped by your goals. We'll kind of touch on that at the very end here. The virtual handout that I posted in the chat includes a QR code for this paper. You've also got a direct link to the paper that's publicly accessible there. If you want to read it, that's great. It is written very specifically for this context, though. Okay. So when we talk about that intro to the intro, the real thing that Long and Farrow lay out here is these 5 C's, right? We want to talk about the common ground, a complication of some kind to that common ground. We want to say how that's of concern. Then you want to give me a course of action for how to overcome that. And then you'll ultimately tell me what your contribution will be having done what you told me you were going to do, right? So on that first section, that common ground, this is the state of knowledge as it stands right now, or at least what's generally agreed upon. This will, of course, vary by your topic, right? And how much you can say is generally agreed upon will depend on what kind of questions you're asking. We want to really quickly lay out the basic assumptions, any boundary conditions, any prescriptions of the literature as it stands right now. Now, in an academic setting, we're typically talking about, academic journal articles here. For the SCA, we're a little bit looser about that, right? Things like secondary and tertiary sources are typically totally acceptable to us. The thing I really think is cool is if you can pull on other people's A&S entries or classes that they've taught, right? That's a degree of freedom that we don't typically have in academia, but you're able to do that. And being able to really build on work is one thing I would like to see more of in the SCA. Our goal with this stage is to convince the reader that we are a reliable guide to this topic. This is not the place to be revolutionary, right? You want to convince them, hey, I'm a knowledgeable person, and I can concisely summarize what you need to know to get up to speed with me, right? Or at least to establish that we're on the same page if they're a fellow expert, right? If you can't establish that common ground, it's pretty likely that any reader is just going to dismiss your work as kind of untethered to reality if they know about the topic, or they'll just find it irrelevant to what they're interested in or anything that they can relate to or want to read more about. This is the first place you can lose in a paper, right? I pick it up, I immediately start reading what this is about, and if it just seems like total esoterica, well, I'm probably not going to continue, right? Now, you may have a very nice judge that's obligated to read the rest of it, but you may have lost their confidence already, right? You have to convince the reader that you've presented whatever existing literature there is relevant to your topic, right? With accuracy, and you've done it efficiently. It's really easy to info dump at this stage. That should not be the tack that you take. I want to hit what I need to hit and then move on, right? Again, we're not going to do this by listing our credentials either, right? You may have a doctorate in whatever topic you're interested in. That's great, right? I believe you because of the knowledge you have, not necessarily because of the credentials after your name. That becomes even more true typically in an SCA context where we're doing things that we may not have any formal training in, right? We want to demonstrate our credentials or our knowledge, right? Not by listing them, but by giving enough of the research situation as it stands to convincingly frame whatever the current state of the literature is, at least as it's relevant to our current topic, right? Whatever we're going to talk about going forward. Stay on topic here is really the strong message. This can be especially difficult for us in an SCA setting, right? if you're writing in an academic context, you can be pretty sure that most of the readership of that journal article are going to be fellow experts, or at least students trying to become experts in that field. The SCA, you're almost always going to be writing for a mixed audience, right? You might have people self-selecting a little bit based on interest, but generally going to be pretty broad, right? So you need to really carefully consider how much of that context is needed to understand where the central argument or the central question of our paper is coming from, right? Is there anything you can't understand without whatever I'm going to give you here, right? Now, again, remember, this doesn't have to be exhaustive, right? In fact, it's probably going to be detrimental to try to be exhaustive in this case. This is just us gathering together at the start, kind of confirming that we're ready to go forward before we set off on the rest of this paper, right? Okay, so let's go back to that whiteboard. For your topic, let's get what you consider to already be well understood. Now, I understand this may be a lot, right? Kind of in brief here, right? What would most people that know about this topic agree about it? If you were teaching someone, what would you consider fundamental to them understanding it? And let's jump back. So this is more difficult than it sounds, typically, right? We think, well, okay, it's common ground. Surely, if we're talking about what's already known, this has to be pretty easy to do, right? We're not doing the cool new stuff just yet. But this is an important step, right? Especially in light of the last element where we talk about what's going to change based on what we've done. If you haven't done a good job of convincing me what we collectively know at this stage, I'm not going to value whatever you say your contribution is, because I won't really be able to perceive the change in state, right? You need to demonstrate to me, or you're going to do the first part of demonstrating to me that I'll get, or the community will get, some kind of return on investment for having to write your paper. Okay. Looks like we've got some good stuff here. Are we ready to go back to the slides? Okay. So our next C, we need to have some kind of complication to this common ground image. You've done the job of setting up the current state of knowledge. These are the things we can agree upon, but there's some problem with it, right? Otherwise, why would I be writing this paper? I need to show you that what I just laid out as a common ground, what we can all agree on, is not sufficient yet, right? This will be some kind of problem, a puzzle, a twist in that ongoing research conversation, right? This is really, and I'll flag this too, this is one reason to be really thorough when reading with taking notes, right? This is usually where the ideation for a future project really happens, right? You say, okay, I'm reading all this stuff and there's something here that's missing, right? I need some additional piece. Well, maybe you can be the person to fill that piece in, right? You can think of this stage as problematizing the situation. That's a phrase you may have heard in the research context. We're going to talk in some capacity about how the current conversation is inadequate or it's incomplete. Your readers won't be inspired if you're too tentative in challenging their assumptions here, so you do need to have some point of deviation. But your readers are also likely to be turned off by any kind of like scorched earth approach, right? Remember, you've just gone through and gone to the trouble of laying out, here's what we all agree on. If you say, and all of that is wrong, you're all totally off the track, you'll lose them, right? You need to balance incrementalism and novelty here in some respect, right? Now, in the context of an A&S paper, right, this may be more gently done, or it may be less expansive than it's typically done in a research paper, right? Remember, if I'm trying to publish an academic paper, I'm trying to convince an editor and at least two reviewers in most cases that whatever I'm giving them is worth including in the limited space in a journal, right? In an A&S context, that's not as much of a concern for us, right? You typically aren't competing for space in an A&S fair. But what you may be doing is getting a reader interested at this stage, right? If it's, okay, I'm just retreading ground for yourself, at least, this is not going to really capture me. If it's something like you are at an early stage of learning about a craft, right? I do some weaving. I'm not very good at it yet, right? But I'm learning. For me, I'm going to be learning basic skills, and whatever A&S entry I submit is going to involve some basic skill. I am not revolutionizing the field of weaving at this stage, right? So what I need to do is make you, the reader, understand my problem, right? Whatever problem I'm trying to solve at this point. Let's say I want to learn double-faced tablet weaving right now, and I have a couple fundamental skills I need to get to be able to do that, right? You have to do some heavy lifting in terms of make me believe that this is some deviation from what you've just set up, right? In a case like that, the common ground is my current state of knowledge. I make you understand that. And then my complication is I'm lacking some piece that would be helpful to me, right? We're going to jump back to that whiteboard and talk about where the previous point that you laid out, or if you want to change gears, that's fine, where that falls short, right? What do you want to know going forward, but don't know yet? Or what does the community need to know about this if you want to go more expansive? Or if you think you do have the answer, right? What do most people not know yet, right? You may be the one that's figured it out. But you've got to convince me that that's something I need to know. I like that learn with me as a beginner approach, right? Especially for A&S. I think that'll be really relevant to us. Okay, so we've got some good complications, right? There's a gap in our understanding. I do want to flag one thing here with the next point. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, we've identified our shortcoming. We have a complication. That is relatively easy for most of us. We have things we want to learn, right? I believe you that you're super interested, invested in whatever you're talking about. Super Letha, you may run into this similar to me with the fencing thing, right? You have to prove to people that they should care about it, right? I wrote a whole paper on how one period fencing author uses one specific type of parry. To dorks like me, that is the coolest thing you could talk about. You have to sell it, right? This is often the hardest step for us as A&S people, right? I would say for academics too, right? But especially when this is something that you're pursuing in your free time, right? You clearly think this matters. I want to think it matters too. I'm sure your readers do as well, but you often have to get them invested at your level, right? I do want to point out here, just saying there's a gap here. There's a gap in our understanding. That's not a sufficient justification for conducting a study, right? Definitely in an academic publishing context, but I think you can make a more powerful sell most of the time in an A&S context, right? You need to explain why that gap matters to them, right? Why does it matter that I don't know this for certain, right? You have to convince the readers that that gap is of concern, right? So how do the shortcomings in the literature limit our theoretical and our practical understanding of whatever topic we're addressing here, right? In the process of explaining to your readers why the complication is of concern, you're going to justify your search for a solution, right? Really, this is why this entry exists or why this paper exists. This is your moment to make the most powerful, convincing case for you want to read this, right? take some extra care here in an SCA context for the reader that might not be familiar with your topic area. Again, we can't assume like a journal readership at this stage, right? Do that within reason. We can't assume, as those original authors could, that other readers are going to be experts, right? You need to sell the reader on the idea that whatever you're talking about is important. I say within reason because you need to have a degree of confidence here, right? You know it's interesting. Speak to why it's interesting. Okay, so back to our whiteboard, right? Why does the shortcoming that you just pointed out matter? I'm going to actually keep us on the same slide in that whiteboard this time so you can associate your sticky notes. If you had to sell your project to another person, what would you say? I usually like to think of this as the elevator pitch, right? If you were trapped in an elevator for the average time you're in an elevator and you had to say, hey, come to my talk. It's going to be at 12 o'clock. Here's what I'm going to talk about, and here's why it matters, right? Here's why you should come. This is your chance to do that. One thing that academic conferences are good for teaching you, right? Typically, you write at least a brief version of whatever final paper you're going to submit before the conference is open. You ultimately get selected for it. You may get selected to present a poster or a full talk, right? If you've done this in your introduction, you have your pitch for, hey, come to my talk ready already. Same thing in an SCA context. Maybe you're doing something like entering an A&S entry, but you're also going to teach a class on it. Okay. I got a good question while you guys are working on this during the in-person version of this class on how long should each of these elements be. My answer was a saying that I really like for fencing teaching, right? Which is how long is a lunge? A lunge is exactly as long as it needs to be and no longer, right? We could spend a lot of time on most of these things. People could write textbooks on most of your topics, right? For this intro to the intro, I usually shoot for about a paragraph for each of these at the longest, sometimes as short as a sentence. You guys are already figuring out this whiteboard tool better than I am. So we've convinced our reader that we have a piece of information that we all agree on, some basis that we share, right, with our common ground. You said there's a problem, though. It's not enough, right? And you said why it's not enough matters, right? You convinced me. I'm on board. I believe you. You need to do this paper. Help me, teach me, right? What are you going to do about it? This is where you say what you're going to do, right? You're going to lay out your course of action now. So again, you've convinced me. I'm sold. I'm going to read the rest of this paper. What do you do, or what did you do? Usually these are in retrospect, right? So in the process of telling me what you're going to do to resolve this complication, you're going to convince your reader that that course of action that you lay out is both relevant to the problem and it's effective for solving it. This can go by the wayside a lot of the time. Usually we say, common ground, problem, you should care, and then it just sort of drops down a little bit and we start talking about what we did, right? You need to sell me, again, right? At every stage, keep me invested, keep me reading, right? Why should I think that what you chose to do was the right answer for solving this issue? Oops, wow. Okay. So to be convincing at this stage, the logic of that course of action has to be really tight, it has to be well explained, and it has to be clearly directed at whatever that central complication that you offered in the second step was, right? Now, you'll have a full methods section for your paper if this is a typical research paper where you're handling or collecting data. Again, that may not be what we're doing for a lot of these entries, but if you are producing something with what we in Meridians would call a static entry, or if you are performing something, you're probably in your documentation going to tell me about your process at some stage under some heading, right? So is that not redundant here? Well, not quite, right? This is not a duplicate of that later section. There, you're going to explain your procedure in great detail, probably in some kind of narrative format, right? Here's where you're going to lay out your general plan, right? So for an example, I just wrote a paper this past weekend, or entered a paper this past weekend on integrating 3 sources on sword and rotella fencing from Bologna. My approach was to do an inductive, data-based approach, looking at the balance of action types across those 3 sources and sort of, meta-analytically, if you want to phrase it that way, comparing those sources. You may have different things that you list here, but you want some kind of short answer like that at this stage. So we're going to go back to the whiteboard again. Here you're going to tell me how you will, or how did you, if you're talking about a past project, address the shortcoming that you identified. So what's the plan? If you had to tell me a short little blurb. I think Keelan, tell me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, is giving us an interesting one here, right? Especially for an SCA project. My background is so focused on those empirical research studies, my mundane background, that sometimes I can lose track of this, right? I'm not a historian. I'm very fortunate to know some very talented ones, and it has been a learning experience for me to write the way that they write, or to poorly imitate it. Maybe. Okay, yeah, creating a database of existing pieces, right? Maybe we've got a possible, experimental archaeology thing here building. I think finding a mentor and documenting process is an interesting one too, right? This is realistically something that many of us will probably be looking for if we decide to enter a new category, right? Speaking of experimental archaeology, that's really kind of what Sumerlethe sounds like he's talking about too, right? Sort of this extrapolatory approach. Okay, sounds like we've got some good courses of action here. So let's land it with our last one. All right. So you've told me what you're going to do. Now you have to tell me why what you're going to do will matter to me in the end, right? Now, hopefully you've done a lot of work already to help this along, but now we're going to talk about our contribution, right? So we have a common ground. There's a problem with it. Problem matters. Here's what I'm going to do to address the problem. Now that I've addressed it, here's what changes, right? So we've described a solution that's convincing, it's compelling to the reader. Now you're going to be in a position, having done that, to highlight how the paper that you've just written or the project you've just made influenced the conversation. how it makes some valuable contribution. We're going from academic to more distal SCA phrasings, right? That's pretty typical for if I'm trying to get a paper published, right? Again, please publish my paper. You have limited space. I want my work to be there. I'm going to tell you that this matters for our field. Typically, in an academic setting, that'll be things like theoretical contributions. This will shift the research conversation itself. It might prompt new research writing. People may ask new interesting questions based on these findings. And it may have practical implications, right? So in my field, again, maybe managers should do different things, or you should hire different, or people on different characteristics, right? You might want to put teams together in different ways, right? But in an SCA setting, this may be, if people read my paper, here's what they'll learn, right? Maybe it's here's what they'll learn if they're at a similar skill level to me too, right? It may not be I'm the greatest expert that has ever done this. We will need to convince the reader that we're going to shift something. We're going to move the ball forward by doing this, right? This is worth thinking about in that implications context, though, right? So how might your work influence how prior work is interpreted, right? Will this kind of shift our perspective on other things? I think particularly with what Keelan is talking about, Sumerlethi too, maybe I can really say confidently like, nah, that's probably a mostly fictional account, or hey, maybe there's elements of this that are really reflective of actual training, right? When we talk about theoretical and practical implications in an SCA context, what does this mean, right? Well, theoretical implications generally means it's going to change how you think about the problem. We will ask different questions based on the findings, maybe, right? Or I might approach my work in a different way. In terms of practical implications, this is usually a little easier for us to think about, right? You read my paper, it's going to do something to how you do your work, right? If you're a fellow beginner in our banner example, right? Maybe you, if you're at a similar stage now, are better equipped to tackle a similar problem, or at a more kind of meta level, right? Maybe the process of you talking about finding and interacting with a mentor itself is helpful in that way, right? There's both this physical aspect and kind of a social one that maybe you can guide some people. With my example with the Rotella paper, my goal was, hey, I'm going to teach a 7-week introductory, sword and Rotella unit in my HEMA school. Here's my process, right? And at the end of that, I get the tools to put together 7 useful lessons, hopefully, right? In an SCA context, right, we want to be honest but not bashful, right? If we're writing for the SCA, we're probably not writing for publication. Some of you may, that would be great. I totally want to hear about it, right? It's probably most useful, though, to think about this in terms of how members of those interest groups that are already kind of tracking with what you're doing, how they would receive the findings if they were to read your paper, even if it may not be widely distributed. Don't think too much at this stage about like, well, how are they really going to do that, or are they likely to? Let's assume for the reader, they're reading this, they'll get this benefit, right? To make this land, you have to have done a good job initially of orienting the reader to whatever that common ground was. Here we're essentially saying how the common ground should change after our contribution to the conversation, right? I've entered some new piece, and now going forward, that stream is going to go off in a different direction. In what we would call the discussion section of your paper, that's usually after your results, you'll probably cover some future directions for research. This may be relatively modest in the case of producing a static entry, right? What's your next entry going to be? Are you going to apply the skills you've learned or the information that you gain in some way in that forthcoming project, right? this is your chance if advancing in A&S, award structures is something that you're interested in. You can show progression here, right? That's a desirable characteristic in most cases, right? More generally, you can talk about new questions that might be prompted based on what you found. Keep that in mind, but reserve most of that for the end of your paper. Okay, so at the last here, right, we're going to go back to the whiteboard one more time and talk about having addressed that shortcoming in the literature or in the research conversation more generally. What would change about that conversation given that you've done what you've talked about doing? What new questions might come up if you found what you were looking for? Like that, understanding ancient people as people, right? It's easy to lose track of that kind of human element. Selling this in terms of impact on newcomers, if that's a relevant audience, is definitely a good one. Gary, I definitely think, especially in archaeology, we've seen a couple of those major finds where it kind of makes you reevaluate all the pieces that you found before, right? Marius, this room for growth is a big one, right? Especially in an SCA context, right? Maybe we're not phrasing this so much in like huge community impacts, right? But just the impacts on your future projects. Okay, looks like we got some good stuff. Right? So let's go ahead and we will jump back just to the very end here. Okay, so we have our 5 C's, right? Common ground, complication, concern, course of action, and contribution, right? So what's next? You've written the intro to your intro. Now you have to write the rest of the intro in some capacity, probably, right? What that will look like will depend on the type of paper you're writing, and you may have a decent amount of text left to go before you hit that next major heading. But the rest of your introduction may take more or less space here. You might use this space for things like articulating specific research questions, right? Really narrowing that down and being concise with what you're investigating. You might advance and ground hypotheses. This would be pretty typical for us in my academic context, right? Whether you will have hypotheses, even if you're gathering data, will depend on what type of research you're doing, right? Remember, you should only advance a hypothesis if you have sufficient logic undergirding it, right? You might give additional specific context for your project. This might include a general description of the type of work you're producing, the type of work you're performing, and any kind of associated history with it, right? Lastly here, you might include a concise or relevant literature, or excuse me, concise and relevant literature review of a topic or several topics, right? Again, this is a moment of temptation, right? Most of us really like reading about our thing. We want to share that reading with other people. Really consider when you're doing a literature review or when you're including a literature review, how necessary is that to understanding and making the rest of this paper useful, right? We've done some, a very brief form of literature review in the common ground section already, right? But you may want additional sections here, right? You're not writing for a thesis board, right? You don't need to show me, the reader, that you know all the possible citations you could pull out here. Keep it on track, right? If anything's needed, short statement, citation, short statement, citation. usually the way to go, right? And this should flow, again, towards some logical end, right? I'm citing sources in a chain that are building to some point of conclusion, right? So whether you include any or all of those pieces and the way in which you decide to present them, that's all going to depend on your project goals. The type of work you're trying to do will matter here, and it'll depend on the state of the conversation before your project, right? Depending on what that common ground looked like, you may need to do a lot or not very much of this, right? I will say it here too, that like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? So if you're going to make a very big claim, like the thing that everybody agrees didn't happen until this later date actually happened at this earlier date, well, you really need a lot of information to support that claim even, right? Even before we get into the rest of the paper here, right? So we've written the rest of our introduction now, right? Well, what comes after that? This will again depend on the type of project that you're doing. For an APA paper of the type that I would typically write and the type addressed by Lange Fair, the introduction will typically be followed by a method section, right? So you'll get into how you collected data, the procedures of that data collection, and so on. People are often confused by that perceived overlap. We've kind of talked about this already, between the course of action part of the 5 C's and this following method section, if that's something you include. The course of action section, remember, should be really general. This is kind of broad strokes what I'm going to do. And it should serve to orient the reader to the general outline of your plan to solve whatever problem you've identified. Really what you're saying is, here's what I'm going to do in general, and you'll see that fulfilled in my method section, right? If that's something that you end up including. Now, by contrast, that method section, if you do have one, will be a detailed, linear, chronological description of what's being done in your study or your project more generally, right? This may not involve data collection if you're just producing something. That's fine, right? But if you're doing a weaving project, I want to know about the process of finding your pattern or maybe drafting your pattern, right? What did threading look like? What was your turning sequence? You know, what were the elements you looked for to maintain tension and all of those things that go into producing that type of work, right? You'll also want to, in one form or another, address any materials used, talk about any analyses that you conducted. One thing I do want to urge you to consider, right? I'm a data guy. I think it's cool, right? If you produce something, especially if it's something I don't know really how it's made before reading your paper, I would love to read any kind of observations that you had, especially the more systematic you can be about gathering those observations, the better, right? If you are doing something like recreating a historical martial art, record your observations, right? Give me, practice notes, anything here would be great. Okay, that's what I've got for you today. I'm happy to talk research methods, statistics, data handling, all those sorts of things, as well as writing. Thank you for coming out. Adios, folks.